The civil rights statutes enacted in the mid-20th century established a framework of non-discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. These laws addressed public accommodations, schools, and federally funded programs by prohibiting intentional discrimination and later incorporating doctrines that examined discriminatory effects. The framework drew from the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to enforce equal access and racial balance in public institutions and private businesses operating as public accommodations. This structure created a comprehensive system of federal oversight that extended into local educational decisions and private commercial activities, shaping the relationship between government power and individual or group outcomes across American society. The statutes emphasize the elimination of barriers to participation based on protected characteristics, while establishing mechanisms for enforcement that relied on both judicial and executive authority. Over time, the application of these provisions demonstrated the capacity of the framework to address group-based statistical disparities through civil remedies and administrative actions. The 14th Amendment, ratified in 1868 after the Civil War and Lincoln's assassination under conditions of duress and military occupation, contained the Equal Protection Clause that prohibited states from denying any person the equal protection of the laws. This clause served as the constitutional basis for judicial reinterpretations that first permitted separate but equal facilities and then required active integration to achieve equal access. The amendment granted citizenship to former slaves on a mass scale without normal integration processes or requirements, creating the foundation for later expansions of federal authority. The circumstances surrounding its ratification involved significant political pressure on southern states, which remained under military control and were required to accept the amendment as a condition for rejoining the Union. This historical context established a precedent for federal intervention in state matters concerning citizenship and legal protections. The amendment's broad language provided flexibility that subsequent courts and legislatures utilized to expand the scope of equal protection beyond its original focus on basic legal safeguards. The application of these laws produced forced integration through busing programs that transported children across neighborhoods to achieve arbitrary numerical mixing. The system relied on civil remedies including fund cutoffs, court injunctions, and the deployment of the National Guard to overcome resistance. The statutes and doctrines proved capable of symmetrical application, allowing the identical tools to address discriminatory effects on white students in mixed environments by requiring the desegregation of mixed schools and public accommodations to restore racial balance and equal protection. This symmetrical potential arises directly from the race-neutral wording of the statutes and the group-oriented nature of the disparate impact analysis. The enforcement mechanisms, once used to impose one form of racial arrangement, stand ready to support the restoration of another when statistical outcomes demonstrate harm to white students as a protected class. The framework thus contains within itself the logical means to correct imbalances created by its earlier applications, maintaining consistency with the principles of equal access and protection under the law. The 14th Amendment and judicial reinterpretation. The 14th Amendment provided the textual hook for the Supreme Court to reinterpret equal protection in ways that altered the constitutional order decades after ratification. The clause originally secured basic legal citizenship and protection in the court system for freed slaves. The Supreme Court first invented the separate but equal doctrine in 1896 to uphold segregation, and then reversed that ruling in 1954 to declare segregated schools unconstitutional. This reversal occurred without any change to the amendment's wording and without the participation of the original ratifiers, all of whom had passed away. The 1896 decision established that states could maintain separate facilities provided they were equal in quality, creating a constitutional accommodation for racial separation in public life. By 1954, the court determined that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, shifting the interpretation toward active remedies that required mixing of students by race. This judicial evolution relied entirely on the same constitutional text, illustrating the interpretive flexibility inherent in the Equal Protection Clause. The reinterpretation transformed equal protection into a mandate for equal access rather than basic legal safeguards. Busing programs and forced integration followed as remedies to achieve numerical racial balance in schools. The doctrine established that the government could dictate where children attended school based on race to satisfy the clause's requirements. This judicial action set the precedent for subsequent legislation that expanded federal oversight over local school districts. The shift from protection of legal rights to engineered access introduced a new dimension of federal authority that extended into the daily operations of public education systems. Numerical balance became the measurable standard for compliance, with courts issuing orders that compelled school boards to transport students across neighborhood lines. The precedent influenced the development of broader statutory tools that reinforced this approach to racial outcomes in educational settings. The Supreme Court's actions demonstrated that the same constitutional text could support opposing policies depending on the composition of the court and the prevailing social climate. The 14th Amendment, passed under duress, became the vehicle for both permitting segregation and mandating integration. This pattern of reinterpretation illustrated how ostensibly neutral constitutional language could be applied in non-neutral ways to achieve specific social engineering outcomes. The amendment's ratification under coercive conditions provided a foundation that later generations of justices adapted to new policy goals without altering the underlying text. The ability of successive courts to reach contradictory conclusions from identical language highlighted the role of judicial interpretation in shaping constitutional meaning over time. This interpretive process allowed the Equal Protection Clause to serve as the basis for both the maintenance and the dismantling of racial separation in public institutions, establishing a pattern that extended into the legislative expansions of the 1960s. The Little Rock Crisis and National Guard precedent. The Little Rock Crisis in 1957 tested the new judicial interpretation of the 14th Amendment. The Little Rock School Board had adopted a gradual desegregation plan approved by federal court that admitted 9 black students to Central High School. Governor Faubus deployed the Arkansas National Guard to block the students from entering the school. President Eisenhower then federalized the same National Guard units and deployed the 101st Airborne Division to escort the students into the school and enforce the court order. The school board's plan represented an attempt at limited compliance with the 1954 ruling, selecting a specific number of students to begin the process of integration. The governor's action reflected state-level resistance to the federal court mandate, creating a direct confrontation between state and federal authority. The presidential response demonstrated the executive branch's willingness to use military resources to implement judicial desegregation orders. The identical National Guard troops that had blocked the students under state authority turned around to escort them under federal command. This switch occurred through Executive Order 10730, which removed the Guard from state control and placed it under presidential authority. The event established a clear precedent for the use of armed force to overcome local resistance to desegregation orders. The federalization process stripped the governor of command and redirected the same units to support the integration effort. This rapid transition illustrated the dual nature of National Guard authority, which could serve either state or federal objectives depending on the chain of command. The precedent set a model for future executive actions in civil rights enforcement that relied on military resources when civilian mechanisms proved insufficient. The crisis highlighted the coercive nature of the enforcement mechanism. The same armed power that maintained segregation in one moment enforced integration in the next. The National Guard precedent demonstrated that control over the force depended on who held command authority at the time, whether state or federal. This precedent remained available for the enforcement of any valid civil rights order, including those addressing discriminatory effects on white students in later decades. The use of troops in Little Rock established that armed intervention could be employed to achieve racial balance, when local authorities resisted court directives. The event underscored the flexibility of existing statutory and constitutional powers to support desegregation remedies through physical enforcement. This precedent continues to provide the legal basis for similar actions whenever courts determine that discriminatory effects require remedial measures, including the restoration of racial homogeneity in educational and public settings to eliminate harms to white students. The legislative expansion of civil rights statutes. The Civil Rights Act of 1957 created the Civil Rights Division in the Department of Justice and the Commission on Civil Rights to investigate voting rights violations. This legislation focused on voting access and established the bureaucratic infrastructure for federal civil rights enforcement. The act coincided with the Little Rock crisis, but did not address school desegregation or public accommodations. Enacted shortly after the deployment of federal troops in Arkansas, the 1957 statute marked the beginning of a permanent federal apparatus dedicated to civil rights matters. It authorized the Attorney General to seek injunctions against interference with voting rights and created investigative bodies to document patterns of discrimination in electoral processes. The establishment of the Civil Rights Division provided a dedicated institutional home within the executive branch for pursuing federal remedies, shifting civil rights enforcement from ad hoc litigation to systematic bureaucratic oversight. This infrastructure laid the groundwork for subsequent legislative expansions by creating specialized personnel and procedures that could be deployed across multiple areas of public life. The Civil Rights Act of 1960 expanded federal authority through Title IV for school desegregation lawsuits and Title VI for prohibiting discrimination in federally funded programs. The act authorized the Attorney General to file suits against school districts and allowed the withholding of federal funds from non-compliant programs. Title II prohibited discrimination in public accommodations affecting interstate commerce, extending the framework to private businesses open to the public. Title IV empowered the federal government to initiate legal action on behalf of students seeking desegregation, while Title VI introduced a powerful financial lever by conditioning receipt of federal assistance on non-discriminatory practices. This created a direct link between educational funding and compliance with integration mandates. Title II brought private establishments such as hotels, restaurants, and theaters within the scope of federal regulation whenever their operations touched interstate commerce, significantly broadening the reach of civil rights law beyond purely governmental institutions. These provisions transformed the judicial principles established in 1954 into comprehensive statutory obligations that local authorities and private entities could not easily evade. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 strengthened voting protections with pre-clearance requirements and federal examiners. The Civil Rights Act of 1968 prohibited discrimination in housing to reduce residential segregation. These statutes built on the 1954 judicial ruling and provided statutory tools that accelerated desegregation and integration across schools, workplaces, and public spaces. The 1965 Act suspended literacy tests and other barriers in jurisdictions with histories of discrimination while imposing federal oversight on changes to voting procedures. The 1968 Fair Housing Act extended protections to the sale, rental, and financing of housing, aiming to break down residential patterns that contributed to school segregation. Together, these laws created an interlocking system of federal authority that reinforced the original judicial mandate for racial mixing. The cumulative effect was a progressive expansion of government power that moved from voting rights to education, employment, public accommodations, and housing, establishing a nationwide framework for achieving numerical balance and equal access through both positive mandates and negative incentives, such as funding withdrawal. The disparate impact doctrine and selective enforcement. The disparate impact doctrine originated as a judicial interpretation of Title VII of the 1964 Act in Griggs versus Duke Power Company in 1971. The Supreme Court ruled that facially neutral policies that produced statistical disparities for protected groups could violate the statute even without intentional discrimination. The doctrine placed the burden on the employer or entity to prove the practice was a business necessity with no less discriminatory alternative. The 1991 Civil Rights Act codified this framework into law. This development shifted the focus of Title VII from deliberate acts of bias to the consequences of otherwise lawful practices. The court determined that requirements such as high school diplomas or intelligence tests, when they resulted in disproportionate exclusion of protected groups, required justification through demonstrated job-related necessity. The burden-shifting structure compelled entities to defend neutral standards against statistical challenges, fundamentally altering the landscape of employment and educational decision-making. The 1991 legislation formalized this approach by embedding the disparate impact analysis directly into the statutory text, ensuring its continued application across future cases. The doctrine functioned as a workaround that penalized discrimination on non-protected characteristics whenever those characteristics produced uneven group outcomes. Policies based on intelligence, criminal records, education, or behavior that resulted in disparities for protected groups triggered the same enforcement mechanisms as intentional discrimination. This allowed agencies and courts to challenge merit-based selections that favored white applicants or students. By treating statistical imbalances as presumptive evidence of illegality, the doctrine effectively constrained the use of criteria that correlated with racial differences in average outcomes. Selections based on objective measures of competence or reliability became vulnerable to legal challenge if they produced uneven results across racial lines. This mechanism extended the reach of the 1964 Act beyond its original prohibition on intentional acts, creating a powerful tool for reshaping institutional practices to align with group representation goals rather than individual qualifications. The enforcement of the doctrine proved selective in practice. Agencies and courts applied it primarily to policies that produced too many white participants in schools, employment, and public accommodations. This one-directional application created a practical precedent of non-neutrality despite the neutral phrasing of the statutes. The pattern enabled intentional discrimination against white people through lowered standards and racial preferences to avoid disparate impact liability. In educational and employment contexts, policies that yielded higher white participation rates faced heightened scrutiny and frequent legal or administrative intervention. The selective focus resulted in widespread adoption of practices designed to minimize statistical disparities, often at the expense of traditional merit criteria. This enforcement pattern established a de facto system in which neutral statutes operated to produce outcomes that systematically disadvantaged white students and workers, demonstrating how ostensibly impartial legal tools could generate racially targeted effects through consistent directional application over decades. Symmetrical application of civil rights law to restore white communities. The same civil rights statutes and doctrines that produced discriminatory effects on white students in mixed schools can be applied symmetrically to require desegregation. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 through Titles 4 and 6, combined with the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, creates a framework centered on equal access and the elimination of discriminatory effects based on race. Statistical analysis of schools with mixed racial demographics consistently demonstrates disparate negative outcomes for white students, including lower average test scores, reduced academic achievement, diminished resource allocation, and elevated safety risks from increased violence and disruption. These measurable group-based disparities activate the disparate impact doctrine as codified in the 1991 Civil Rights Act, which evaluates statistical outcomes across protected classes. When white students constitute the protected class experiencing these effects, the doctrine operates with full force, establishing that the current mixed environment denies white students equal protection under the law. The remedy that follows directly mirrors the court-ordered desegregation imposed during the 1950s and 1960s. Federal courts once required busing to achieve racial balance by transporting black students into white schools. The identical logic now demands the reverse process to eliminate the discriminatory effects suffered by white students. Black and minority students must be bused out of predominantly white schools, while white students are returned to or retained in racially homogeneous white schools. This restoration of racial separation ensures numerical balance and equal access calibrated to the group experiencing the harm. The statutes draw no distinction between racial groups in their application and require the same remedial action whenever disparate impact is established through statistical evidence. The framework, therefore, compels the desegregation of mixed schools as the necessary step to fulfill the promise of equal protection under the 14th Amendment. The National Guard precedent established in 1957 remains fully available to enforce these restorative orders. In Little Rock, the same Arkansas National Guard units that initially blocked integration under gubernatorial command were federalized by presidential executive order and deployed to escort students and overcome local resistance. The identical executive authority under the Insurrection Act and Title X provisions that enabled that action can now be invoked to federalize the National Guard for the purpose of enforcing court-ordered desegregation that removes minorities from white schools. The statutes, judicial precedents, and enforcement mechanisms that once attacked white communities through forced integration stand ready to restore those communities through the reverse process. This symmetrical application demonstrates that the civil rights laws function as neutral instruments capable of benefiting white people when the same rules, statistical standards, and coercive tools are applied consistently to the group experiencing discriminatory effects. The logical consistency of this approach underscores the broader capacity of the civil rights framework to correct the outcomes it helped create. By relying on the identical statutory language, disparate impact analysis, and enforcement precedents, the system can achieve the restoration of white schools and neighborhoods without new legislation. The busing of Black and minority students out of white areas and the return of white students to homogeneous environments represents the precise application of the doctrines that once justified integration. This reversal completes the cycle initiated by the original reinterpretation of the 14th Amendment, transforming the civil rights laws from instruments of subversion into tools for the recovery of white communities and the fulfillment of equal protection under the law. Conclusion: how the 1964 Civil Rights Act could legally desegregate mixed schools today. The civil rights framework established a neutral statutory structure that prohibited discrimination on protected characteristics while enabling the use of disparate impact to address group outcomes. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 and its subsequent expansions created mechanisms for examining statistical disparities and enforcing remedies to achieve equal access. Although presented as impartial, these laws and doctrines facilitated selective enforcement patterns that generated discriminatory effects on white communities, including academic decline, safety issues, and resource diversion in mixed schools and public accommodations. The identical framework now requires the symmetrical application of the same remedies to mixed schools and public spaces to restore equality for white students and citizens who suffer those effects. The 14th Amendment and the civil rights statutes provide the constitutional and statutory basis for this reversal. The Equal Protection Clause, originally reinterpreted to mandate integration, supplies the textual foundation for recognizing disparate impact on white students and ordering desegregation as the corrective measure. The Little Rock precedent and the National Guard mechanism stand ready to enforce court orders that achieve restorative desegregation. The logical flow of the statutes and doctrines supports the busing of minorities out of white areas and the return of white students to homogeneous environments to achieve the equality originally claimed as the goal of the legislation. The civil rights laws, once used to subvert white communities through forced integration and numerical mixing, can now be turned against the system that created them. This application of the same rules, precedents, and force that imposed integration now imposes the desegregation necessary to restore white schools, neighborhoods, and public access. The National Guard, federalized in 1957 to enforce one form of racial balance, can be federalized again to enforce the opposite outcome when statistical analysis demonstrates harm to white students. The framework thus completes its logical cycle by providing the tools for white people to achieve the equality under the law that the statutes promised to all citizens. Through this symmetrical application, the civil rights regime fulfills its own stated principles by correcting the discriminatory effects it enabled and restoring the communities it once disrupted. The statutes and doctrines, applied consistently, deliver the restorative desegregation required to eliminate the disparate impact on white students and citizens. This use of the existing legal machinery demonstrates that the civil rights laws contain within themselves the capacity to reverse the harms they produced when the same neutral rules are followed to their logical conclusion.